Hey everybody, welcome back to the Captain's Coffee. I'm David, and today we're talking about honey processed coffee. Joining us once again will be our good friend, the SR800. Only this time, we're upping our game with the extension tube from Fresh Roast. That's right, this will be our last video in the series on roasting specifically with the SR800, so we're going out with a bang. Now don't worry, we'll revisit the SR800 plenty more in our videos. It is currently my favorite home roaster after all. But we've now covered most of the coffees you'll run into with this roaster, and it's time to spread the love. With that being said, once again, we're talking about honey processed coffee today. We'll go over what honey processing is, what to expect when roasting it, and we'll wrap up with a sample roast using our extension tube. All right, now cue the intro. Oh wait, cue the shameless plug. So just before we dive in today, I want to take a minute and thank everybody from the bottom of my heart for the support our channel has been getting lately. It keeps us making these videos and helping out our fellow home roasters, and that just means the world to me. If you want to continue supporting us and you have a few bucks in your wallet, head on over to our shop at thecaptainscoffee.com. Snag yourself some green coffee, a grinder, or even an SR800. If typing isn't really your thing, we've got a link in the description below. It'll take you straight there. And if you're strapped for cash, you can support us simply by liking and subscribing. It really helps us out, and I appreciate you taking a second to give those buttons a tap. Now, cue the intro. So let's start with the basics. What is honey processing? Well, oddly enough, it's got absolutely nothing to do with honey. More on that in a bit, though. First, honey processed coffee is a semi-washed coffee, also known as pulped natural. In order to keep this section brief, we'll really quickly review the difference between washed and natural processed coffee. But if you'd like to dive deep into those methods, we've got links in the description below for videos on both. So with fully washed or wet processing, layer by layer, all of the fruit from the coffee cherry is removed from the bean before it's allowed to dry in the sun until it reaches 10 to 12% moisture. At this point, the parchment or final layer is removed and the beans are ready to sort and ship. With natural or dry processing, all of the fruit is left to dry on the bean until the whole thing reaches 10 to 12% moisture. Then the fruit is entirely removed and the inner beans are ready for shipment. So with honey processing, it starts just like fully washed. The ripe cherries are depulped, removing the very first outer layer of the cherry. But then we switch to a natural processing. You see, at this point, the beans are still covered in a sticky sweet substance known as mucilage that's removed during the fully washed process. The mucilage-covered beans are allowed to dry in the sun until they reach 10 to 12% moisture. Finally, the parchment and dried mucilage are removed from the bean before sorting, shipping, and bagging. So why is this called honey processing? Well, in Spanish-speaking countries, it's common for the mucilage to be nicknamed honey or miel, since it's sticky and sweet, like honey. Can see why it stuck. Sounds way better than mucilage processed. Also, I mentioned before, some folks call this pulped natural, since the pulp, which is what the outer skin of the cherry is called, is removed before it's dried, just like in natural processing. Once again, I think calling it honey processing stuck just because it sounds way cooler. Honey processed. But David, I hear you say through the internet, what's with all these colors, like red honey and black honey? Great question, new internet friend. The different colors you might see attached to honey processed coffee refer to the change in color as the mucilage is oxidized with exposure to air. Variables such as the amount of mucilage left behind on the beans, as well as the amount of humidity and sun exposure, will change the mucilage from clear all the way to black. White and yellow honey processed beans tend to have the least amount of mucilage and therefore will taste more like their fully washed counterparts. Gold and red honey have a significant amount of mucilage left on the beans, and the color they turn as they dry has more to do with the amount of humidity in the environment. They will lean more towards a natural process flavor profile. Finally, black honey has the most amount of mucilage left on the beans. This is the most difficult to process of all, and great care must be taken to ensure the beans don't rot or over-ferment. This means they're usually much more expensive, and they'll have a really similar profile to natural processed coffee. Moderate to low acidity, complex, and bursting with flavors. However, there's one important disclaimer for this color naming system. You see, the issue is the specialty coffee industry doesn't have a system in place for analyzing and classifying these different colors. It's really up to the producer to decide how to classify their honey processed beans. It's kind of like how we can definitively say that a food is grown organically because there's a regulatory body in place with rules about what that means. However, anybody can slap all natural on a label and it might mean something, or it might just be a buzzword. Honey processed color classifications are like this. That's why many importers and producers prefer to just say honey process and let their work speak for itself. Others will classify their coffee with these color names because they're proud of their work, but with the understanding that it opens them up to extra scrutiny since they're probably demanding a higher price for their coffee. My advice is buyer beware. Honey processed coffee is delicious, but always use your own discernment when you see a premium being charged for a black or a gold honey. If it's a seller with a great reputation, it's probably great, but there's always a chance it could just be hype. Now, on to the good stuff. How should we gear up to roast honey processed coffee? Well, that largely depends on the origin of the beans. Honey processing is most popular in Central and South America, where high-quality beans are usually categorized as SHB, meaning strictly hard bean, or SHG, which means strictly high-grown. These beans are going to be quite dense and hardy, so they'll stand up to heat pretty well. That being said, if we're trying to preserve the flavor imparted by honey processing, we want to keep our roast range between light and medium. For this example, we'll settle on a compromise and shoot for a City Plus roast, which I consider to be right in between light and medium. We'll plan to end our roast after first crack is well underway, but before it ends. Now let's talk about heat, specifically how quickly or slowly we'll add it to the roast. Since we're using the extension tube today, that changes things a bit. The extension tube is great for tons of reasons, which I've mentioned in another video. But if we're doing a normal charge of 225 grams, the beans will spend less time in contact with each other, since there's more space to move around. That means the bean mass as a whole will be less efficient at absorbing heat early on in the roast. Thankfully, the extension tube allows for way more fan and power headroom due to a more efficient design, so this really isn't a problem. We'll just note that while using the tube, our temperature will need to be reading a good bit higher than if we were just using the stock roasting chamber. We're going to push quite a bit of heat early on as we power through the bean mass, which works perfectly with our goal of a light to medium roast. Now, as far as roast time goes, we're going to run this one hot and fast. We'll aim for first crack between 6.5 and 7.5 minutes. Once first crack is underway, we'll allow the beans to develop for about a minute to a minute and a half, bringing our total roast time to 8 to 9 minutes. As always, this is just one method that I prefer, but feel free to experiment once you get comfortable with your roasting setup and the beans. That being said, when we're talking about a light to medium roast, I'd steer clear of roasts under 7 minutes and over 11 minutes. Roasts that are too short will be underdeveloped or scorched on the outside and too green on the inside, resulting in a sour, acrid tastes. Roasts that are too long will be baked, leaving the cup with a flat taste and very little body. Now, what about chaff? Honey processed coffees produce a moderate to large amount of chaff. Since they're right in between natural and fully washed, that comes as no surprise. If you plan on overcharging your extension tube, be really careful that you don't overload your chaff collector and risk starting a fire. As always, let's finish off with some basic reminders on best practices when using the SR800 or any home roaster. Make sure you're using a power outlet that's on a dedicated 20 amp or higher circuit. Avoid using extension cords when possible. Check your ambient temperature to ensure it's above 60 degrees in colder weather. During these hot summer days, if you roast outside at really high ambient temperatures, say over 90 degrees, your roaster's air temp will also be hotter, so remember to start with slightly lower temperature settings. If you're roasting inside, turn on your oven's exhaust fan or roast near open windows. So now that you know the basics of honey processed coffee, it's time to share a sample roast. Now keep in mind, following this roast exactly isn't guaranteed to be a perfect roast for you and your coffee, since every coffee is a little different and unique in its own way. I hope this is a great starting point that you can use to gauge adjustments in order to find the roast you're looking for. For best results, always keep a roast log, noting your adjustments during the roast, and keep notes of which roast tastes the best. Because at the end of the day, all that matters is that you like your coffee. Now let's get roasting. Today we're roasting a delicious honey processed coffee from the Manos de Mujer Cooperative in Honduras. We'll be using a charge weight of 225 grams for this sample roast. We'll start with our fan set at 8 and our power all the way down to 4. This helps the beans get moving while they're the heaviest without scorching the ones on the bottom. So now that the beans are moving well, I'm going to go ahead and drop the fan all the way down to 6 and the power down to 2. As you can see from our temperature, we're already at 380 degrees Fahrenheit in the chamber. If I was running the stock roasting chamber, I'd be concerned about that much heat, but the design of the extension tube from Fresh Roast allows more movement, and you'll see that even when pushing significant heat throughout the roast, we don't roast too quickly, or risk scorching or underdevelopment. Here we are just after the 3-minute mark, and our beans are transitioning from the drying phase to the Maillard or caramelization phase, as you can tell by their yellow color. The beans are moving pretty significantly, so I'm going to drop the fan to 5, and since we're already at 425 degrees, I'll also drop the power to 1, since lowering the fan will increase the heat further. Remember that at this transition, our beans should be around 320 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'm staying about 100 degrees ahead of them. That's a heck of a lot hotter than I'd be running with the stock chamber, but as I mentioned, it's not unusual with the extension tube. Just shy of the 5-minute mark, it's time to wrangle in those beans again, so I'll drop the fan to 4. Notice we're at around 450 degrees in the chamber. The beans should be at around 350 degrees since we expect first crack at 380 degrees, so we're still staying about 100 degrees ahead of them. Our heat is stalled a bit, so I'm gonna bump the power to 2 in order to push the beans over the edge into first crack. This should give us enough momentum to ride into first crack and then to end of roast, since we're not going to second crack. Here we go. We got our first snaps of first crack at around 6:45, and by 7 minutes, first crack is well underway. I'm going to allow the beans to develop for around 1 minute and 15 seconds, which should round out a nice light to medium, or what I call a City Plus roast. If you start to hear first crack trailing off, go ahead and pull your roast before the crack ends. Now once I hit cool, I'll fast forward through the cooling cycle, but don't forget to increase your fan throughout the cycle as necessary to keep the beans cooling as quickly as possible. Finally, during the last 30 seconds of the cooling cycle, I like to remove the chaff collector early to keep chaff from falling back into the beans when the cycle ends. If you do this, be sure to turn down your fan a couple notches and wear gloves or oven mitts to remove the chaff collector, as it will still likely be pretty hot. You can always vacuum up any chaff that flies out using a shop vac. So there you have it, our guide to roasting honey processed coffee with the SR800. I really hope you found this video helpful, and I hope you learned something new. If you did, leave us a like down below and subscribe for more coffee roasting and brewing guides. You just click the thing right here, subscribe. If you want to see more awesome guides, we've got videos here, probably, yeah. If you have more questions about roasting or suggestions of your own, leave us a comment down below. We really do read all our comments and we try to respond to them quickly. That's it for today. Thanks for watching and happy roasting.